They laughed when someone mentioned my name. Then they saw my face, and the laughter died, because I was supposed to be erased, not invited. My brother had spent years making sure I never existed in their world. To them, I was a problem, an embarrassment he quietly locked away so he could marry into money and power. When they asked about his family, he spoke of success, struggle, sacrifice, but never me. I learned early that silence can be taught, especially when it's wrapped in the word love. I didn't fight it. I disappeared exactly the way he wanted. I took the insults, the pity, the slow humiliation of being treated like a shadow. While they rose higher, I stayed lower, watching, listening, remembering. People like them talk too much when they think no one important is around. Years later, I walked into their party without announcing myself. Expensive lights, expensive smiles, cheap souls. At first, I was invisible again. Then recognition hit one of them like a delayed slap, a pause, a stare, a whisper. Faces turned. Someone muttered that I looked like a ghost. My brother dropped his glass. I didn't look at him yet. I wanted him to feel the fear first. They tried to place me, failed attempts to act polite, to pretend they hadn't once reduced me to nothing. I spoke calmly, casually mentioning details I shouldn't have known, old conversations, private deals. Each sentence landed softly, but I could see the damage spreading behind their eyes. Confusion turned into panic. Power melts quickly when it realizes it's being watched. When they finally asked who I really was, I told them the truth. Not loudly, not angrily. Just clearly, I was the person they convinced my brother to erase. The one he sacrificed so he could belong. The silence after that felt heavier than any insult I'd ever swallowed. My brother pulled me aside, shaking, accusing me of destroying his life. I told him I had only returned what he gave me, years of quiet, perfectly timed. He had mistaken my patience for weakness, they all had. By the end of the night, phones were buzzing, reputations cracking, alliances quietly collapsing. I didn't threaten anyone, I didn't demand revenge. I simply let the truth walk through the room the way I once did, ignored at first, then impossible to escape. I left before anyone could stop me. Behind me, their perfect world didn't explode, it rotted slowly. Publicly. Exactly the way humiliation should. They hid me because they thought I was nothing. They broke because they learned I was everything they forgot to fear. I didn't go home after that night. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew something had started, and beginnings deserve space to breathe. By morning, the party had become a rumor. By afternoon, it became a headline without my name attached to it. That was intentional. Power collapses faster when it doesn't know where to point its anger. I watched from a distance as explanations were issued, statements revised, and smiles rehearsed for damage control. My brother didn't call. Silence had finally become mutual. I remembered how different things used to be. How invisibility felt like suffocation. Back then, I used to believe humiliation was loud mockery, insults, open rejection. I was wrong. The most effective humiliation is administrative. Being removed from conversations. Being edited out of family photos. Being explained away as complicated. They didn't scream at me, they simply decided I didn't count. That decision had shaped my life more than any cruelty ever could. While they built their empire, I built something quieter. Skills no one noticed. Connections no one suspected. I learned how systems work because I lived beneath them. I learned how people lie when they're comfortable and panic when patterns are broken. I didn't plan revenge at first. I planned survival. Revenge came later. Disguised as clarity, the elite in laws were experts at image. They donated publicly and exploited privately. They spoke of ethics while negotiating with men who didn't believe in laws. None of it was hidden. Just buried under confidence, and confidence, I learned, is the laziest form of security. Days after the party, one of them reached out, not directly. People like them never do. It came through a mutual contact. Wrapped in politeness and concern, they wanted to talk. I declined silence again, controlled, intentional. Silence makes powerful people confess to themselves. My brother finally showed up at my door a week later. He looked smaller than I remembered, as if success had been a costume that no longer fit. He didn't apologize, not really. He spoke about pressure, expectations, love with conditions. He told me I didn't understand the world he had married into. I told him that was the problem, I understood it too well. He asked me what I wanted. I answered honestly, nothing from him. That hurt him more than any demand could have. When people build their identity around sacrifice, they can't stand being told it was unnecessary. He left with the same emptiness he once handed to me, and for the first time I didn't feel responsible for filling it. The investigations didn't explode. They unfolded, accounts frozen temporarily, partnerships paused pending review, invitations stopped arriving. Their names were still spoken, but more carefully now. I had learned long ago that destruction doesn't have to be dramatic. It only has to be precise. Sometimes late at night I questioned myself. Not about whether they deserved it, but about what this made me. That question lingered longer than guilt. Was I becoming what I hated? Or was I simply refusing to remain what they needed me to be? The answer came unexpectedly. I received a message from a young woman I didn't know. She said she'd recognized herself in the whispers about me. She worked for one of their companies. She'd been told to stay quiet, to accept less, to be grateful for proximity to power. Seeing them shaken had changed something in her. In herself, that's when I understood revenge is not only about taking. Sometimes it's about redistribution, of fear, of awareness, of balance. I never stepped fully into the light after that. I didn't claim a throne or replace them. I stayed adjacent, influential, but undefined. Power hates ambiguity. It needs labels to control outcomes. I refuse to provide one. As for my brother, we speak occasionally now, carefully, honestly. He knows he can never hide me again, and I know I no longer need to be revealed to matter. What we lost can't be rebuilt, but something quieter exists in its place, truth without performance. People still ask about that party. They call it a turning point, a scandal, a mystery. They never mention my name. That's fine. Names are temporary. Impact isn't. I used to believe being seen was the goal. Now I know being unavoidable is far more powerful, and somewhere in rooms I no longer enter, people still pause when my story comes up. Not because they fear what I did, but because they wonder who else they decided didn't exist. That doubt will follow them longer than I ever could. The doubt didn't stay contained. It spread the way uncertainty always does, quietly, through glances and half-finished sentences. I could feel it even without being present. When power structures begin to question their own reflection, they grow cautious, and caution is the first fracture. I kept my distance on purpose. Visibility had served its function, now restraint would do the rest. People assume revenge requires constant involvement, that you must keep pressing your hand against the wound. In truth, the most effective damage happens after you step away. Absence forces others to imagine your next move, and imagination is far crueler than reality. My name circulated without context. Some remembered it as a mistake, others as a warning. A few tried to locate me, offering apologies disguised as opportunities. I declined them all. There is something deeply unsettling to powerful people about not being able to buy forgiveness or control the narrative. It made them restless. Restlessness leads to errors. One error surfaced sooner than expected. A leaked email chain meant to be internal accidentally found its way into the public sphere. Nothing illegal on its own, just enough arrogance. Just enough contempt for ordinary people to shatter the carefully rehearsed image of benevolence. I hadn't sent it, I hadn't needed to. Once credibility cracks, gravity takes over. I watched reactions instead of events. Who defended whom? Who went silent? Who rewrote history in real time? Patterns emerged, alliances that had never been as strong as they pretended. I had studied those patterns for years, back when I was invisible and underestimated. When people ignore you, they reveal themselves without realizing it. My brother struggled the most. Without his in-law's absolute certainty, his own confidence began to unravel. He had built his identity on belonging to their world, and now that world looked at him differently, less as an asset, more as a liability. It was a familiar position, one I didn't rush to explain. He asked me once if I hated him. I told him the truth again. Hate requires energy. I had already spent mine surviving. What remained was clarity. He nodded as if that answer scared him more than anger would have. Anger is temporary. Clarity is permanent. As weeks turned into months, consequences settled into routine. Boards reshuffled. Quiet resignations followed louder personal decisions. Philanthropic gestures increased, which told me everything I needed to know. Guilt doesn't donate, fear does. I started receiving invitations again, different circles this time. People who valued discretion over spectacle, influence over inheritance. They didn't ask about the past. They didn't need to. They understood what it meant when someone walked away from power instead of chasing it. I chose selectively. Control, I had learned, comes from choice. Sometimes I thought about the younger version of myself. The one who agreed to disappear out of loyalty, out of fear, out of love that wasn't returned equally. I wished I could tell that version something important. Being hidden doesn't make you small. It makes you observant. And observation, over time, becomes leverage. There were moments of loneliness. Revenge stories rarely talk about that part. When the noise fades and the adrenaline drains, you're left with yourself changed, sharper, less forgiving of illusions. But loneliness is manageable when it's chosen. It's far better than the kind imposed on you by other people's ambitions. One evening, long after the headlines had moved on, I ran into one of the elite women at a public event. Not a party, something neutral, professional. Our eyes met briefly. No hostility, no apology. Just recognition. She looked older, tired in a way money can't fix. She nodded. I nodded back. Nothing more was needed. Walking away, I realized something quietly profound. I no longer wanted anything from them. Not acknowledgement, not regret, not even fear. My life had expanded beyond the perimeter of their influence. That was the real victory. The one no one applauds because it doesn't need witnesses. The world didn't become fair overnight. It never does. But it became slightly more honest in the spaces they once controlled without question. Sometimes that's enough. Change doesn't always arrive as revolution. Sometimes it arrives as hesitation, power pausing before it speaks, wondering who might be listening. I still attend gatherings now and then. Different rooms, different energy. When people ask about my family, I answer carefully but truthfully. I no longer edit myself to fit someone else's comfort. That habit died the night I walked into that party and refused to be erased again. My brother and I exist in a fragile peace. Not reconciliation, something more realistic. Boundaries, he understands them now. Perhaps too late, but understanding nonetheless. Some lessons require loss to make them stick. Every so often, I hear my story retold by someone who wasn't there. The details are always wrong. They exaggerate the drama, invent confrontations. Imagine grand speeches I never gave. I don't correct them, let them believe revenge is loud and theatrical. The truth is far more unsettling. The truth is this: I didn't destroy their world. I simply stepped out of the shadow they put me in, and their world couldn't survive the light. And somewhere quietly, someone who has been told to stay invisible is listening. Time has a way of softening memories without dulling lessons. What stayed sharp for me wasn't anger, but awareness. Once you've seen how easily people erase others to protect their comfort, you never look at smiles the same way again. I moved cities, not to run, just to breathe in a place where my past wasn't a rumor. There I built a life that didn't need explanation, work that rewarded competence instead of pedigree, relationships that asked who I was, not where I came from. It was quieter than the world I'd unsettled, but far more honest. Occasionally, the past knocked anyway. A former associate of the family reached out once, claiming admiration. He spoke carefully, measuring each word as if the wrong syllable might undo him. He wanted advice, mentorship, reassurance that history wouldn't repeat itself. I listened, then declined. I had learned something crucial. Not every bridge deserves to be rebuilt, especially when it only ever led one way. What surprised me most was how often people tried to extract a moral from my story. They wanted a lesson neat enough to package. Something inspirational, something digestible. I never gave them one. Real consequences don't fit into slogans. They're messy, uneven, and often misunderstood. The truth made people uncomfortable, so they reshaped it. That was their choice. I no longer needed to manage it. The elite family continued to exist, of course. Power rarely disappears, it rebrands. New faces, updated values, the same instincts. But they were different now, more careful, less certain. They had learned that invisibility can be strategic, and that the people they overlook are often the ones paying attention. That awareness changed how they treated others, not out of kindness, but calculation. Even that was progress of a sort. Fear, when applied correctly, can be educational. As for me, I found myself mentoring quietly, not publicly. Not officially. I gravitated toward people who had been sidelined. Assistants who knew more than they were allowed to say, junior analysts with better ideas than their managers, women whose competence was mistaken for inconvenience. I didn't promise them justice. I offered tools, knowledge, timing. The rest, I let them decide for themselves. One night, after a long conversation with someone standing exactly where I once stood, I realized something had shifted. My story no longer felt like an open wound. It felt like a reference point. A line I could look back on without flinching. That's when I knew revenge had completed its cycle. Revenge isn't meant to be lived in. It's meant to be passed through. I saw my brother once more after that. At a distance, he looked stable. Less ambitious, more human. Perhaps the collapse of illusions had freed him too in its own way. We exchanged a nod, that was all. Some relationships don't need closure, they need limits. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd never walked into that party. If I'd stayed hidden, preserved the lie for the sake of peace. The answer comes easily now. Peace built on erasure isn't peace, it's postponement. People think recognition is what gives you power. They're wrong. Power comes from knowing who you are even when no one is watching, and refusing to negotiate that truth for acceptance. The world still favors the loud, the wealthy, the well-connected. That hasn't changed. What has changed, at least for me, is the certainty that those advantages are fragile. They depend on silence, and silence, once broken, is impossible to fully restore. I don't attend elite parties anymore. I don't need to. The rooms I occupy now don't require permission. They don't laugh at names they don't recognize. They listen first. And when someone asks me how I learned to navigate power so calmly, I give them the only answer that's honest. I learned it from the shadows, from the years I wasn't supposed to exist. Years passed, but the echoes of that night never faded. The party had been the first time I was seen, but not the last time I was remembered. I walked through life knowing that those who once ignored me now carried a quiet suspicion whenever my name surfaced. That suspicion was invisible, yet far more potent than any confrontation. People fear what they cannot control, and I had become that fear. I didn't chase them, I never needed to. Instead, I observed, studied, and anticipated. The world rewards those who move quietly, who calculate patience like a weapon. Every misstep they made, every careless smile, every arrogant assertion, they left breadcrumbs for me. And I followed them, learning the patterns, memorizing the weaknesses. Revenge had taught me timing, patience, subtlety, and I had mastered them. By this point, the family had expanded their empire, businesses, charitable foundations, public influence. All the appearances of success were intact, but the cracks beneath the polish were growing. I would hear rumors of internal conflicts, of tempers flaring behind closed doors, of trust eroding between those who thought loyalty was forever. None of it was by accident. They didn't know I was still a ghost in their world, watching, learning, waiting. My brother remained a curious case. He oscillated between pride and fear. He had married into wealth and influence, yet he couldn't fully detach himself from the memory of his sister who had once been erased. I saw him at social events, and every glance carried a fraction of hesitation, as though he was calculating whether I would intervene or simply observe. I did both sometimes, and always I remembered the lesson: Ms. who underestimate you are your most effective teachers. One evening I received a message from a familiar source. The in-laws, indirectly, were requesting a meeting. They spoke of reconciliation, of business interests, of mutual respect. The tone was calculated, polite, yet underlying it was a tremor. They were trying to reassert control, but over what they didn't know. They had already lost the balance, though they refused to admit it. I accepted, but not out of generosity. I went because knowledge is power, and face-to-face observation is a form of control in itself. The room smelled of expensive furniture, polished wood, and a faint trace of arrogance. They didn't recognize me as a threat at first. That arrogance had been consistent all these years. I let them have the comfort of underestimation for as long as I wished. The conversation started formally. Pleasantries, business talk, empty compliments. I responded calmly, measured, interjecting with questions that subtly exposed gaps in their knowledge and awareness. Every detail I mentioned, internal dealings, miscalculations, long-forgotten decisions, was delivered with quiet precision. By the end of the hour, their confident smiles had shifted into uneasy glances. They weren't angry, they were unsettled. Recognition doesn't always need to be violent to hurt. Sometimes it seeps under the skin until nothing feels safe anymore. After leaving that meeting, I realized the world had changed quietly. My presence alone had caused tremors, subtle but undeniable. Power, when confronted with unpredictability, fractures internally. They could maintain appearances. But behind those appearances, fear was spreading. Fear of exposure, fear of miscalculation, fear of consequences they could not control. That is the kind of revenge that lasts, silent, invisible, psychological. I began connecting with others who had been sidelined, ignored, or dismissed by these same circles. I taught them observation, patience, and subtle strategy. Influence isn't about confrontation. It's about understanding the rules and bending them without breaking the surface. They called it mentorship, I called it restoration. For every person they had belittled or erased, I offered a path to acknowledgement, not for applause. The lessons I imparted were precise. One must always appear to comply while remaining untouchable. Timing is everything. Silence can speak louder than any accusation. And never allow anyone else to define your visibility. Power structures crumble when those they consider insignificant begin to navigate them with awareness. Meanwhile, my brother's life became increasingly precarious. The cracks he had ignored for years now forced themselves into his reality. Decisions he had once made with confidence now required consultation. He looked to me occasionally for guidance or approval, I wasn't sure. But he never asked too much. The quiet reminder that I existed and remembered was enough to influence him. I didn't intervene unnecessarily. Observation alone was sufficient leverage. As months turned into years, the once powerful family learned to operate cautiously. They became careful in their words, strategic in their gestures. Every plan was double-checked, every assumption scrutinized. They were more effective, yes, but also more fearful. They knew deep down that the person they had underestimated could reappear at any moment. That knowledge was a shadow they carried for the rest of their lives. My own life had become balanced in ways I hadn't imagined possible when I was hidden and silenced. I had freedom, influence, and respect from those who mattered. I had autonomy, the ability to enter a room, speak truth, and leave without needing validation. I had learned the most important lesson of all: revenge is not about noise, spectacle, or immediate satisfaction. True revenge is structural, invisible, and permanent. People still spoke of that night, the night of recognition, as if it had been a turning point. They exaggerated the drama, invented confrontations that never happened, and painted my silence as arrogance. They were right, in a way. Silence is dangerous because it forces the imagination to fill the gaps. They didn't need me to act, they only needed me to exist, unseen, knowing. And exist I did. I watched, I guided, I waited. When mistakes appeared, I allowed them to unfold. When fear spread, I observed how it reshaped behavior. I never sought vengeance through destruction, I sought it through subtle awareness, through the mental unraveling that occurs when a system realizes it has lost control over its environment. Eventually, I realized that my story had become a template for others like me. People began to whisper, quietly, of strategies to survive in spaces where they were ignored or diminished. They learned patience, observation, and the strength of silent presence. Revenge had multiplied, not as acts of violence, but as the cultivation of intelligence and restraint. I had become more than a single incident. I was a precedent, an invisible warning that no one could erase. And that is how true power manifests, not through aggression, but through the inevitability of consequence. Those who once tried to erase me were reminded constantly that invisibility is temporary only for the unprepared. The family, my brother, and the circles they moved in could never forget. My absence was not emptiness, it was anticipation. They felt it even when I was miles away. That tension, that constant calculation of risk and exposure, was the ultimate revenge, because in trying to control me, they had created the conditions for their own unease. In the quiet moments of reflection, I often thought about the younger version of myself, the one who accepted invisibility out of love and fear. I understood her in ways I hadn't before. I whispered her memory, you waited, you observed, you became unavoidable. And in that silence, I realized that revenge had never been about the party, the recognition, or even the humiliation of those who ignored me. It had been about survival, clarity, and presence. It had been about becoming someone impossible to erase. Even now, I move through life with that understanding. I no longer fear the unseen forces, the arrogant dismissals, or the careful manipulations of others. I walk in rooms knowing that my awareness is more dangerous than their influence, and that patience outlasts impulse. And so, The story continues not as a narrative of confrontation, but as a quiet testament those who are underestimated, ignored, or erased are often the ones who ultimately determine the shape of the world. Power, after all, is nothing without recognition, and recognition is nothing without fear. And I had learned to wield both without ever raising my voice. Agar chaho to main next 1000 words belai ki pura revenge story ko epic, cinematic. Our complete saga banadun jahan every subtle revenge psychological move our ultimate domination ko cover kia j. Time has a way of sharpening observation. I learned quickly that revenge isn't always about dramatic confrontation. It's about subtle pressure, invisible influence, and letting others implode quietly under their own arrogance. Months after the party, the family I had confronted began to make mistakes. Small ones at first: miscommunicated emails, overlooked contracts, forgotten commitments. Nothing I touched, I simply existed, a silent observer whose presence they could not account for. And yet even from the distance of my own life they began to notice. Whispers floated through their circles. Have you seen her? Do you think she knows? What if she sees this? Fear doesn't require a threat. It only requires certainty that something beyond control exists. I had become that certainty. My brother continued to occupy a strange place between admiration and terror. He knew I had power over him, not financial, not social, but psychological. He had learned first then that my patience was strategy. That my silence was a weapon. I did not confront him, I did not demand loyalty. He simply existed in my orbit, cautious, careful, and uncertain. That alone was a form of domination. Opportunities came to me in ways I had not expected. Business contacts, colleagues, even distant acquaintances began to approach me with information, favors, and subtle openings. Not because I asked, but because people instinctively recognize competence when it moves without desperation. They wanted guidance, connections, advice. I gave selectively. Power is most effective when distributed in small doses. Those who thought themselves untouchable discovered that I controlled access to resources they had once taken for granted. The family, meanwhile, tried to reclaim control. They held meetings, issued statements, and attempted to reassert influence over their empire. I followed quietly, noting the shifts in behavior, the micro-expressions of fear when someone mentioned me, the overcompensation in conversations, the hyper-vigilance over trivial details. They were no longer confident. Their arrogance had been replaced with calculation, their dominance replaced with suspicion. That subtle collapse was more satisfying than spectacle ever could be. Sometimes I would remind them of the past, not overtly, not with confrontation, but with small, precise references to forgotten events. A misquoted statement in a public forum, a personal anecdote mentioned casually to a mutual contact. Each incident built unease. Their network began to fracture internally, alliances shifting as fear replaced loyalty. I did not need to speak. Observation, patience, and strategic silence were sufficient. At times I would reflect on my own transformation. The girl who had been silenced, humiliated, and hidden had become something stronger than she had imagined. Revenge had not just been about others, it had been about reclaiming my own agency. I had learned to exist without validation, to wield influence without declaring war, to command attention without speaking loudly. That self-possession was the most enduring power of all. The elite family attempted to adapt. They introduced stricter hierarchies, tighter controls, and more rigorous vetting of associates. But these efforts were always reactive, always too late. The sense of oversight they had once held was gone. They could no longer assume that their choices would go unobserved or unchecked. Every decision carried risk, because the presence of a single informed observer, me, was enough to destabilize their confidence. I also began to mentor others quietly, those who had been sidelined or ignored in similar ways, people who had been undervalued, underestimated, or erased. I taught them observation, timing, and discretion. Influence does not require visibility. Influence requires patience and awareness. Those who learned from me began to implement strategies I had developed over years. They moved carefully, silently, but effectively. Each new person who reclaimed their power became a ripple in the elite network, amplifying the consequences of my own actions without direct intervention. My brother's life became more precarious as a result. His dependence on approval from the in-laws, once a source of comfort, had become a liability. Every misstep, every misjudgment was amplified by the awareness that I existed and remembered. He tried to assert independence, but the psychological weight of our shared history lingered. I never guided him overtly. I simply observed, letting him learn from his own discomfort. The lesson was unavoidable: underestimate me at your peril. Years into this process, the family's empire had become more cautious and controlled, but also more fragile. Their decisions were slower, their confidence diminished. People they once manipulated easily now calculated their own moves with extra scrutiny. Fear had replaced arrogance as their default mode of operation. I had not needed confrontation, threats, or violence. All I had done was exist intelligently, strategically, and persistently. Through it all, I maintained my own life, balancing observation with personal growth. I built a career, nurtured meaningful relationships, and moved through spaces where influence came naturally rather than forcibly. People approached me because they valued knowledge, insight, and precision. I gave selectively, always aware of the power inherent in choice. Influence, I had learned, is never in what you give but in what you withhold. Eventually, the in-laws attempted to reconnect. They sent intermediaries, invitations, and indirect inquiries. They sought reconciliation, favors, or information. I responded minimally, if at all. Each contact was carefully calibrated. They were learning slowly that control is not regained by apology or attempt. It is restored only by recognition of inevitability. They could no longer ignore me, but neither could they command me. That balanced existence without submission was the ultimate revenge. And yet my life remained private, purposeful and deliberate. I didn't seek spectacle. I didn't crave acknowledgement. What mattered was the psychological reality of my presence. They knew I was watching. They knew I remembered. That knowledge reshaped behavior far more effectively than any direct act could. Fear, after all, is far more durable when it exists in the mind rather than in the world. Months turned to years. The family adapted, yes, but always cautiously. They became efficient but rigid. Their ability to take risks diminished. They became meticulous, nervous, and calculated, never fully comfortable. Each decision, each interaction, carried the invisible weight of my existence. I didn't need to act directly. My awareness alone had created a world where consequences were unavoidable, and where silence carried far more power than any shout. In this way, revenge became structural. It was not about humiliation or destruction in the moment. It was about persistence, awareness, and subtle influence. The world around me shifted quietly, irrevocably. I did not need to intervene in every situation. People learned from my presence alone. And as I watched, the structures that once oppressed me adapted, but never fully recovered. The lesson, unspoken but unavoidable, was clear. Those who erase others always leave themselves exposed. And finally, I understood the full measure of what had been accomplished. Revenge had never been about confrontation. It had been about existence, memory, and patience. By surviving, observing, and waiting, I had dismantled arrogance, reshaped behavior, and created influence without aggression. I had turned invisibility into power, silence into strategy, and patience into inevitability. The elite family could rebuild appearances, they could maintain their public image. But the psychological landscape had changed forever. Every glance over the shoulder, every cautious decision, every moment of doubt carried my presence. They could never return to the comfort of certainty. And that was more than victory, it was permanence. And so I lived my life deliberately, quietly, and fully aware of the power I carried. I had learned to exist as someone invisible yet unavoidable. And in that existence, I found the deepest satisfaction of all true, lasting control. Years of observation, patience, and subtle influence had finally come full circle. The family's empire still stood, polished and intact on the surface, but beneath every decision trembled under the weight of doubt I had instilled. Their confidence, once unshakable, had become a fragile facade. They could operate, but never with certainty, and that was the ultimate revenge, the knowledge that their world, meticulously built on control and arrogance, could no longer function without fear. I walked through life quietly, yet unavoidably. My brother had learned to navigate existence with care, aware that his past choices had consequences he could not erase. Others who had once been dismissed or silenced now moved with awareness, strength, and subtle power. All lessons they had internalized from watching me, learning from me, surviving by my example. The ripple effect of my presence had multiplied far beyond what any confrontation could have achieved. I never needed to claim what was theirs. I never needed public acknowledgement or applause. The satisfaction was in inevitability. The truth is the most relentless form of power when people recognize it. Whether silently or unconsciously, it cannot be undone. One quiet evening years after the party, I stood in a room of my own making, safe, respected, and free. I thought back to the girl who had been hidden, humiliated, and silenced. I whispered to her memory, "You endured, you became unavoidable." And with that, the story ended, not with chaos, not with violence, not with shouting. It ended with control, clarity, and presence. The elite family continued their lives, but forever under the shadow of what they had once ignored. They would never forget that someone they believed invisible had quietly reshaped their world. I had survived, I had prevailed, and I had finally become free.